This is Professor Barry Penn-Hollar at Shenandoah University, and you are listening to a lecture in the series introducing Principles of Ethics. This is the second half of a sixth lecture. The sixth lecture is addressing a troubling theoretical and practical question related to the principle of beneficence. That question is, do the ends justify the means? Let's begin by reviewing briefly what that question means. The question of ends and means arises most poignantly when we are contemplating engaging in some act or doing some act that normally we would consider immoral or unethical, wrong. But we are contemplating doing it because we somehow intend through that action to produce good consequences. We are wondering whether the good consequences we hope to produce through the action, the good end, the good result, which is our intention, whether that justifies doing an action that we would otherwise consider to be wrong. So, for example, we generally think putting people to death is wrong, but are we justified in putting criminals to death as a means to protecting society from the harm that criminals do? We generally think that putting patients to death is wrong. But are we justified in putting a patient to death if that is a way and the only way available to us for ending the incredible suffering that his death is bringing upon him? May we cheat on an exam if that seems to be necessary to pass a course, to get a degree, to enable us to pursue a career that will produce great results for us and for others? Should we torture a terrorist if that seems to be necessary to secure information that might protect hundreds of people from harm? Now, of course, I'm not going to provide a definitive answer to the question of ends and means, because there may well not be any such definitive answer. But I do want to point out to you what the implications are of this system of ethics, system of principles that we are using in this course. And the first thing to realize is that because we recognize the principle of beneficence, we have an obligation to do things that are inherently helpful, things that by their very nature make people better off. But there's also a second implication of this principle of beneficence, a second implication of our recognition that we must act in ways that promote human welfare, that make people better off. And that is that we must also always ask ourselves about what might be called the ripple effects of our actions. What are the end results of that chain of events that may be reasonably expected to occur because of our action? And is that end result good or bad? We must take the consequences of our actions seriously, must we not? We are responsible for the good and the evil that are the result of our actions. Yet all the other principles we will identify, or that we will talk about, identify inherent features of human actions that are also morally relevant. We surely must consider the overall consequences of our actions, the goodness and badness of those consequences. But we also must consider whether the act that we engage in the pursuit of those consequences, what its morally relevant inherent features are. Are those actions inherently harmful? Are they inherently manipulative and violate human autonomy? Are they by their very nature unfair or unjust? Do they fail to live up to the legitimate expectations that people have of us because of the commitments we have made or the roles that we play? All of those questions are also relevant, and each of our principles points to a set of inherent features that actions might have that are surely morally relevant. The bottom line here is, then, that the ends may justify the means, though they may not. That's the implication of this system of principles we are using. In terms of the distinction we have drawn between consequentialist and deontological approaches, ours is a deontological approach. It's not a radically deontological approach like Kant's, who said that consequences are completely irrelevant to moral judgment. No, because we recognize the principle of beneficence, we recognize that we are under obligation to consider the consequences of all of our actions, whether they be good or bad. But the other principles require us to balance that consideration of consequences over against the moral significance of the relevant inherent features that our actions have. For example, the recognition of a principle of non-maleficence means that we regard an action that involves harm as immoral, or at least seriously morally problematic. It should always trouble us deeply, to consider engaging in an action that involves serious harm to another. We ought never to do it lightly or without serious moral justification. Yet, our recognition of the principle of beneficence and our recognition that we must consider the consequences of our action, that we are responsible for the overall good and evil that we produced, mean that sometimes producing very good ends or avoiding terribly evil ones may justify actions whose inherent features alone would seem to make them wrong to do. Since protecting ourselves from harm obviously promotes our welfare, we may be justified in harming another person in self-defense, or we may be justified in harming them to keep them from hurting a third party. Even something as seriously morally problematic as war, with all the death and destruction it causes on a massive scale, may be justified if war is necessary to protect a nation's citizens from harm, or to maintain and preserve a system of justice and respect for human rights that's under threat. As we shall see, though lying violates autonomy because it involves inevitably a manipulation of another person, it may sometimes be justified to protect national security, or to protect people's feelings, or to save a marriage. Similarly, though taking people's money and land away from them against their will violates their autonomy, governments may well be justified in seizing our money through taxes, or our land through an exercise of eminent domain, in order to promote the common good by building roads or airports. In other words, our system of 5 principles suggests that the ends may well justify the means. The good consequences that result from an action, or the horribly evil ones that are avoided through some action, may justify from time to time doing something that on its face seems seriously morally problematic, or even wrong. Still, if this system is valid, though the ends may justify the means, they do not always do so. Sometimes, often indeed, the inherent evil of a particular action is so profound and so deep that even though we had hoped to produce some good through it, even though we may reasonably expect to produce some good through it, it is still not justified. Sometimes the good we would seek is too insignificant. Sometimes it is too improbable to be able truly to justify the questionable means that we contemplate. So if the ends sometimes justify the means, but sometimes do not, how does this system of principles suggest we are to think about the matter? Let me suggest the following. The first thing that we must do is ask ourselves some serious questions about the good end, the good consequence that we intend or hope for through our action. Just how good is it really? How morally compelling is it? Consider, for example, the possibility of cheating on a test to pass a course to get a degree to enable you to pursue your career. Now, of course, getting your degree and pursuing a career is good. It's good for you. But how morally compelling is it? Now, of course, we can make the argument more morally compelling by pointing to all the good you will do for the world through your career. But then we must ask ourselves, just how high is the probability that as a result of your cheating on this test, all that good you contemplate will arise? So those two questions must always be asked. How good, how morally compelling is the end that might justify the mean? How morally compelling is it? Obviously, saving a life, or saving 100 lives, or preserving national security, those are morally serious and morally compelling ends, as is the promotion of a society's overall good. But that question must be followed by the probability question. Just how likely is it that we can achieve that wonderful result? Will we be able to save the 100 orphans by torturing this suspected terrorist? Is that really highly likely? Is it likely to work? We must also ask ourselves a couple of questions about the means that we are contemplating, the one that is morally suspicious in the first place. The first question to ask is, how profound is the moral violation contemplated? How deep a violation of moral norms and of human dignity is it? One of the reasons that many people are opposed to torture, even if they thought it might sometimes save lives, is that torture is thought to be about the most profound assault and insult to human dignity that's conceivable. And on that basis, many would argue that torture is never justified. Or consider the scenario where we contemplated a lie to one's spouse about an ancient affair. Some would argue that a lie about something so significant represents the profoundest sort of violation of the trust upon which marriage is built, and therefore could never be justified. Of course, considerations such as these might suggest that there are some morally suspicious actions that could be justified if they were less profound an assault or on human dignity. Some milder forms of torture might meet the test from this perspective. But another set of questions also has to be asked about the suspicious means. Is it necessary? We are contemplating the action on the basis of our hope and our expectation and our intention of producing some good consequence. But we must ask ourselves, could we produce that good consequence in some other way? In some way that did not involve a morally suspicious act, in some way that did not involve lying or torturing or cheating or stealing. If some alternative means of achieving that end is available to us, then surely the end does not justify the means. And even if, and this is the last question, even if a morally suspicious means is necessary, we must work to assure that the means we use is the least profound violation of moral norms, the least profound violation of human dignity necessary to the task. So, in summary, these two sets of questions. How good is the end sought? How likely is it to be achieved through our action? And how profound is the moral violation of the action we contemplate? Is that action truly necessary? Is there some non-morally suspicious means of achieving the end? Is the one we are contemplating the least morally suspicious, the least profound violation of human dignity available to us that could still produce the good end we seek? Let me conclude these remarks with some reflections on an insight offered by Martin Luther King Jr. King argued that the end is already present in the means that we use to achieve it. King is suggesting that means and ends are inseparable. He made those comments in the context of the struggle for civil rights in the United States and in the context of his nonviolent approach to that struggle. Some had suggested to him that violence would be justified and might be more effective in achieving racial justice in America. Obviously, folks like Malcolm X were raising such possibilities. King's response was that that violence could not possibly lead to the end that he sought. The end he sought was not simply the end of segregation. What he sought was integration, or what he called beloved community, genuine harmony between blacks and whites in the United States. Now, while violence might have been an effective way simply to end legalized segregation, in his view, violent means would be totally ineffective as a means to achieve the end of beloved community or true fellowship and friendship between blacks and whites. He said, the end you are seeking, or the end that you can reasonably expect to achieve, reflects the means that you use to get there. If you use means that to profoundly violate human dignity, one cannot expect to arrive at an end or a result that promotes that dignity. Next time, we will turn to the third of our 5 principles. Having considered non-maleficence and beneficence, we will look at the principle of autonomy. See you next time.